Welcome, everybody. It's 2 o'clock in London. We'll wait just for a few more moments to let the crush of participants at the door get in. So we'll be with you in just a moment. Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. Just while more people are coming in, we will start. My name is Tom Keatinge. I'm Director of RUSI's Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies here in London. It's my pleasure to chair today's webinar. Before we get started, I'd ask you absorb the housekeeping points on the screen and note that the full webinar, including the Q&A section, is being recorded. Talking of questions, as usual, if you want to ask a question, do please pose it in writing in the Q&A box, and do please include your name and organizational affiliation. And do, of course, use the upvote function if you're particularly keen to catch our attention with a question that's already been asked. So today's webinar is a collaboration between RUSI's Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies and the Institute's Cyber Research Group. In our Financial Crime and Security Studies team, we research issues at the intersection of finance and security, whilst the Cyber Research Group brings global research focus and capacity to examine UK and international strategic responses to cyber, all of which makes today's topic, the growing scourge of ransomware, once again in the headlines in the past 48 hours, an ideal topic for research collaboration. With that in mind, I'm therefore delighted to welcome you to today's discussion on disrupting the ransomware ecosystem, where I hope we will not only explore what I think of as the front end, that is to say the attacks themselves, how we can deter attacks and better secure ourselves against attack to reduce vulnerability, but also dedicate some time to assessing the back end. In other words, what happens when, and it certainly is when, not if, ransomware attacks occur. As one of our panelists remarked on Radio 4's Today program just yesterday morning, we need to tackle the flow of money. And given the focus of our program at RUSI, this is music to my ears. Another area to consider is the role of cyber insurance. Cyber team colleagues James Sullivan and Jamie McCall, along with Dr. Jason Nurse, professor in cybersecurity at the University of Kent, just last week published this new report using BAE threat intelligence data, exploring cyber insurance's potential contribution to solving this problem. If you've not found this yet, you can, of course, access it via the recently relaunched RUSI website. Another area of particular personal interest, given work I've had the opportunity to do with Dr. Anya Shortland from King's College London, is considering what lessons we might learn from the offline ransom world. How do ransom markets work? And just as we are now all being told by the government here in the UK that we need to learn to live with COVID, should we be learning to live with ransomware? What does that mean in practice? And finally, ransomware is most often about financial gain on the part of those that commit the attacks, which brings us into the realm of cryptocurrencies. What contribution can the rapidly growing crypto tracing industry make as we seek to identify who benefits from ransom payments when they are made? So these are just some of the topics that I hope we can explore today with our vastly experienced panel. So talking of vastly experienced panel, to help us explore these topics and more today, and to guide us through the issues and help us unpack the challenges, and perhaps discern some emerging solutions, I'm delighted to be joined by the following panelists. Jen Ellis is Vice President for Community and Public Affairs at Rapid7 and one of the co-chairs of the US Ransomware Task Force that published a recent paper about which I'm sure we'll hear more during our discussion today. Simone Maini is the Chief Executive Officer of Elliptic, the blockchain analytics company. Ciaran Martin is a professor at the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University and, possibly of more relevance today, until just under a year ago, the first CEO of the UK's National Cyber Security Centre. Graeme Newman is the Chief Innovation Officer of CFC Underwriting. And last but not least, we are joined by journalist and author Misha Glenny. We will aim to run today's event as best we can as a discussion. So as already mentioned, do contribute your thoughts, comments and questions via the Q&A box and make the most of its upvote function. So with all that said, I'm going to start by asking each of our panelists a question that I hope will allow them to share their perspective on the ransomware issues we are all facing. To begin with, I'm going to turn, if I may, to Misha Glenny. Misha, you've written extensively about cybersecurity, dark markets, and the growth in organized crime online. So paint for us, if you will, please, your current assessment of the threats in cyberspace, particularly as relates to ransomware. What should we be fearing and what should we be focused on at present?
Well, I think I'll start, Tom, by looking back 15 months or so to the beginning of the pandemic, because, of course, we, to a degree, have been in suspended animation for the past 15 months. But cyber malfeasance, as I like to call it, taking into account all the sort of bad things that go onto the internet, has, of course, not been standing still. In fact, if anything, it's been accelerated during that period. In part because there was a degree of criminal activity, which was offline activity, which after the pandemic could no longer be continued. So when it comes to organized crime, you have seen a tendency over the past 10 years of organized crime groups, traditional syndicates, to assimilate cyber techniques, either cyber-assisted or cyber-dependent criminal activity. And that got a real shot in the arm with the pandemic because of all the opportunities for fraud and scamming around such things as the provision of PPE and so on. And the reason why I mention this is because it addresses what, for me, is one of the key issues which we're experiencing now with ransomware, amongst other things, and that is an issue of scale. So but since you've seen this shift in criminal activity towards online in things like, for example, the retail drug distribution markets, you have seen law enforcement agencies around the world having to invest more and more into recruiting officers who are highly cyber literate, not to say computer engineers and so on. And this is taking up a lot of cash, a lot of intensive work. There have been some significant breakthroughs in law enforcement, but this activity also bleeds into things like ransomware. When is this the state that has to respond? When is it private companies? When is it, so when I say the state, when is it things like intelligence agencies or the military, and when is it law enforcement? So there are a lot of gray areas there into how you respond. But that issue of scale really came into focus for me with the SolarWinds attack. And every time we have seen attacks since then, it's taken that scale a notch up. And this meeting is fortuitous in that it happens just after the Kaseya attack. And this is, again, a new level because it combines the deployment of ransomware against a managed service provider, which is, provides for thousands and thousands of companies around the world. And so suddenly a single ransomware attack has a much, much bigger impact than it has ever had before. And this is something that we can only engage in the long term. In the short term, there are all sorts of things one can do to try and mitigate ransomware. But in the long term, we have to start thinking hard about rules of the road internationally. I'm glad to say that just this year, we've had the conclusion of two quite important, the reporting of two quite important bodies at the United Nations. One was an open-ended working group, and the other was the group of government experts. I think they're sixth or seventh iteration, and they have come up with consensus agreement in the UN about the need to subordinate the state's use of ICT to international law. So I think we're seeing in the background, I know that there are discussions going on, sort of track 1.5 informal discussions between various Western countries and Russia and indeed China. Ultimately, if we don't have some establishment of a coherent rules of the road to which all countries agree to, then ransomware is going to be a chronic and often very damaging problem.
Great, Misha. Thanks very much. I think yes, we will come to the kind of the international rules of the road dimension. I'm sure, but Ciaran, yeah, I imagine the picture that that Misha was painting is one you recognise from your time leading the NCSC. So how well are we organising ourselves at the moment to combat ransomware attacks from the perspective of individuals, governments, corporations, the palette of affected actors?
Well, I agree with Misha's analysis, and it's got worse since over the past year. And indeed, there's an issue which experts like Misha are better qualified to comment on than I am as to whether actually we may look back at 2021 as a period when the ransomware gangs overreached because of the disruption they're causing to everyday lives and vital services, rather than just extorting what they would see as wealthy corporations for money. But I think one of the reasons we've got to this stage, which is it's nobody's fault, but in most national security or other risks in life, there are factors that work in either direction. You know, some favor those defending themselves from harm and some favor those seeking to attack. But at the minute, we've got this weird and unfortunate imbalance where basically everything favors the attackers. There is a safe operating environment from Russia. There is intrinsic and long-standing structural weaknesses in Western cybersecurity. And there's a series of business model incentives, the ease with which ransoms get paid and the role of cryptocurrencies in enabling that, which favor a very profitable, as Simone's company have identified, a very profitable insurance industry. A very profitable ransomware attacks, and we'll talk later. And I know Graeme and I have different views on what the insurance industry might do to counter this. So at the minute, we have a bunch of things that all work in favour of the attackers. It's nobody's fault. It's just happened that way. So one overarching principle I think we've got to think about is whether we're actually serious about this as a national security risk. I mean, Jen and others were involved in the US ransomware task force, US led, although had other contributors, and an excellent report. And it says that ransomware should be treated as a national security threat. The Biden administration has essentially said they're treating it as a national security threat. And sometimes we do, and sometimes we don't. But if it is a national security threat, sometimes we are privatizing the response to it. So if you take, for example, some of the high-profile recent ransomware attacks. So the attack on Colonial Pipeline, key decisions were taken by the private company, and then the US administration came in afterwards. In healthcare in the US and in some parts of Europe, you know, when you think about ransomware on a health service, on a health institution, you have criminals based in another state threatening literally the lives and well-being of innocent civilians. That sounds like a national security threat to me. In the United States and some European countries, the immediate response is in the hand of private sector hospital chief executives. That doesn't sound right to me. In Britain, that happened, an accidental North Korean ransomware attack in 2017. In Ireland, it happened a deliberate attack on the state healthcare service in 2021. In both Britain and Ireland, the response was government-led. Now, that reflects the structure of the health services, but there's something to learn from that. Ireland has fared no worse by a resolute government refusing to pay the ransom than US private companies have fared when they've paid. I do think, you know, criminals are exploiting fundamentally the fact that our open societies leave an awful lot of what is now a systemic and sustained national security threat in private hands. Now, there's all sorts of really, really difficult policy choices that flow from that about the rights of private companies to do what they want, the rights of insurers to give them the services that they're entitled to, the free flow of commerce and all the rest of it. But fundamentally, there has to be something about thinking, if we're serious about this as a national security threat, doesn't government have to do a bit more to intervene, to take charge of some of these situations, to ensure there's proper victim support, to ensure that their capabilities are pointed in the right direction, et cetera, et cetera. So the fundamental question for me is, are we going to get serious about this across the Western Alliance as a national security risk, or are we going to continue to leave it to private and individual institutions to manage the response?
Thanks for that. Can I just pick up something you said right at the beginning of your response? You said that 2021 might be the year we look back on where we think, oh, some of these groups overreached. What do you mean by that? Why do you say that?
Well, in a discussion that will otherwise be uniquely depressing, I'm trying to inject a possible reason to be optimistic. Now, there's no evidence yet to be optimistic on a sustained basis, but some strange things were happening. Why did the Irish Health Services executive get a decryptor key for free? Why did so-called dark side at least pretend to disappear for a while, and so on, and so on? Because ransomware works well, it works best from the attacker's point of view when people pay money in secret, essentially, and nobody really notices, which is one of the reasons why another of the issues is about whether or not there should be mandatory disclosure, at least, if not, some form of curtailment of payments. So it works best when it is an invisible crime. It's not victimless. I mean, stealing money from companies harms people, but it's invisible. When you start to cause panic buying of petrol in the east coast of the US, when you start to more seriously cause postponed cancer operations and severely curtailed maternity care in an EU member state, where you cause when you take out the main food retail capability in thousands and hundreds of Swedish villages, that's when you start to annoy people. So one of the reasons why, I mean, at the minute, as I said, every discretionary factor up until now has been working in favor of the criminals. One of the challenges for Western governments is, can you make this, and Misha is much more expert on this than me, or probably anybody of the rest of us on the panel, can you make hosting these criminals a problem for Putin and for the regime in Russia? And it is possible, and I say it no more than that allowing large-scale harmful social disruption to be done on a near weekly basis, which is what's happening in 2021 from Russia, might in time begin to be a problem, but it's too early to tell. But that's why I say it.
Good to understand that. So, Jen, just briefly, just thinking about what does this mean in practice? So your company, Rapid7, says on its website it's here to help clients reduce risk across their entire connected environment. So what does this mean in practice? How do we reduce the risk of ransomware? How do we try and harden the perimeter before we go on and talk about the back end?
Oh dear, you said that word that you're not supposed to say, the P word, perimeter. I think, the verbiage that you're referencing on the website is really trying to get at the fact that today IT environments are hugely complex. They are not guarded by a perimeter in the traditional sense that we used to understand. And so it is really challenging. And I think actually the Kaseya incident, which Misha mentioned in his commentary earlier, highlights this, right? You're now dealing with layer after layer after layer of sort of abstraction where it can still impact your organization. I mean, imagine being a local dental practice and your systems go offline because the people who provide your technology support are using a piece of software that was compromised. I mean, it's so many layers back. You've got cloud environments, you've got remote workers, you've got so many layers of distribution and complexity. And it's really, really hard when you're trying to build defenses to factor all of that in a way that really sort of hardens your environment and makes it hard for others to get in, particularly considering that the number one most successful attack vector is still phishing or social engineering, which is really much more about how individuals behave than it is about how technology behaves. So it's really, really challenging to build defenses. There are basics, things that people can do. And I would say the top one is user education. Like, that is your number one attack vector. So you do have to have your users become more savvy about what looks suspicious and how to respond. People advocate for multi-factor authentication for the same reason, so that, you know, if your employees' credentials are compromised, it makes it harder to get into systems. Patching. Unfortunately, Kaseya were in a bit of a race against the attackers to get their systems patched. And I would say, you know, now is the time. If you make technology or operate technology and you are aware of vulnerabilities in that, you have to stop deprioritizing the patching on that. Even if you think that they're relatively trivial, the Kaseya issues were relatively trivial, and look at the impact. You need to patch these immediately. I could go on at length, and this is part of the challenge, is that there is so much complexity that it's hard for organizations to feel that they've taken the right action, but we're limited on time and I don't want to use the entire hour, so I'll leave it there.
Okay, yeah, message clearly received. But turning to Graeme, so the attacks get through. Obviously, cyber insurers seem to be playing, you know, an increasing role in resolving ransomware attacks, or at least getting involved in the aftermath. And that seems to be attracting more and more attention. So maybe you could just sort of set the record straight, as it were. How do cyber insurers get involved? What are they offering victims of ransomware attacks who have cover?
Thanks, Tom. And yeah, it's difficult representing the insurance insurers. Feel like I'm having to set the record straight. There's a lot of misreporting. So again, as Jen says, I'll try not to consume the hour by doing that. But I think the first important thing to say, and I reference the RUSI report because it had some interesting media spin on it, which I don't think necessarily took the report at face value. The insurance industry, the principal role, and I mean the principal role of the insurance industry is to provide resilience. It's about providing resilience to companies. Our job is to help companies manage adverse events and minimize the financial impact upon those businesses. That is our primary role. Our primary role isn't to make companies more secure, nor, that's not it might be a nice byproduct at some point, but that's not. And our principal role is not to only insure the most secure companies. So being criticized that always is, it feels a little bit rough. It's like saying that motor insurers should be responsible for improving driving standards or vehicle safety. That is not the role of the motor insurance industry. In a fully functioning insurance market, some of these things may come as a byproduct, but our job's resilience. So what do we do in that sense? Well, I always kind of liken the cyber insurance industry a little bit to 1667, and it's a while ago, but that was the formation of the insurance industry, right? At the time, there was no public sector provision of a fire service, right? So that's Great Fire of London. There was no public provision of a fire service. So the fire offices were established, and when you bought an insurance policy, what you were buying was access to the fire service because the insurers owned the fire trucks. And there's a parallel with cyber insurance right now. There is no state-provided security service. Ciaran was referencing the role that government might play in nationalising and privatising it. That there is no state-provided service unless you're national critical infrastructure, and still the support is questionable, if I may say that. So we kind of filled the gap, and the insurance industry has over time played that role of filling the gap, where the public sector, I'm sure, will have that bigger role to play, but it takes time to put that infrastructure in place. So right now, for the vast majority of small and medium-sized businesses, we're the people that they call. And the provision of services is around providing all of the support, and that is financial and professional and technical, to help those businesses get back and running. I see it as our job to get them back up and running as quickly as possible. So that might mean providing forensic support, it means remediating the issues, clearing the environment of threat actors, and that can be done, by the way, with either third-party panel providers. Some insurers have that in-house, so different people provide it in different ways. Helping with the business resumption effort, we spend a lot of time migrating people from on-prem servers to Office 365, bringing storage area networks to get them back up and running quickly. We cover loss of profit, so during the downtime, we'll help businesses manage so they can survive after the event, so they can still pay their employees. When data is lost, we help them to recover the data and pay for the cost of reconstituting it if it can't be recovered. You know, this is all about financial resilience for these businesses. We provide them with threat intelligence gathered on various threat actors so they can make better decisions about what to do. And okay, now's the time for the thorny issue. What do we do about ransoms? Believe me, insurers do not want to pay ransoms. I do not know. I know all of the cyber insurers, and not a single one of them wants to pay ransoms. And it's our client's ultimate decision to take. And I'm afraid to say, let's be really honest, there are times when there is no other alternative. They can basically risk putting their business out of business, rendering many people redundant, or revealing secrets that frankly should never be revealed. So there's no alternative. In those cases, clients may facilitate a ransom payment. And many insurance policies cover reimbursement of that. But this is a really crucial point, is reimbursement of that. The client makes the decision. It's an after the event decision. So the insurance is an after the event insurance policy in that sense. The client is making the decision to pay based upon their own ability to pay, which is a really crucial point when it comes to some of this misrepresentation about insurers fueling this. We don't give them any more financial capability. They have to make the payment themselves with their own resources. They make those payments not in the certainty they're going to get them recovered. We use obviously sanctions rules because we are heavily regulated entities, as lots of financial services people know, heavily regulated with strict AML procedures, very strict, more so than some crypto exchanges, I would say. So we are heavily regulated, and therefore we have to provide a lot of checks. When a client pays, they don't know they're going to get recovered. So that is how we try and design a system where we're not creating perverse incentives for more people paying, which is why I personally don't think that we should ban the insurance industry from paying ransoms. If we want to ban ransoms, ban people from paying ransoms, not insurers from doing it. It would make no difference. So yeah, sorry, I could go on, say, as Jen said, for hours, but I'll pause for breath.
We'll come back to that, but yes, thank you for laying that out. And Simone, just coming to you finally. Obviously, here we're talking about payments. The payments are almost entirely made in cryptocurrencies, which your company Elliptic is all about tracing. And we did see some unusual news recently in the context of the Colonial Pipeline attack, where some of the ransom payment was reportedly recovered. So what are you seeing from your company's perspective, looking at the blockchain, doing the kinds of tracing activity you offer?
Yeah, thanks very much, Tom. I'll try to keep it brief because I know you want to get into the meat of the discussion as well. So, absolutely, crypto is playing a key role in this, and sort of similar to Graeme, have some sympathy with him. Crypto is almost on trial here in the debate as well. But I think it is very nuanced in terms of how we think about it. Crypto at the end of the day, very much like the internet, it's a tool, and so we have to think about how we adapt to working with that tool and create rules and regulations around it to make it safer to work with. And so there are lots of things that we can and should be doing around that. Excuse me. Ciaran talked about the fact that there are safe environments for the ransomware operators to exist. I think the same is true for unregulated crypto exchanges, and so that's definitely something to further explore. What can we do to shut down those opportunities? But going back to your question, particularly around Colonial Pipeline, while there has been huge growth in the scale of this, and we talked a little bit about the audacity of some of these attacks, one of the things that is also happening in a more positive way is that we are seeing that some of these groups are not beyond the reach of the law. And some law enforcement agencies, particularly in the US, have been able to successfully disrupt some of these networks by tracing the ransomware payments and ultimately seizing the funds. And we saw in Colonial Pipeline, an example where the FBI and DOJ were able to seize, I think it was about 85% of the ransom paid ultimately. And I think, that does clearly demonstrate two things. First of all, the issues or the benefits, depending on your point of view, of moving funds on a fully traceable open blockchain ledger and the power that can give you. But also we're seeing the payoff of governments really starting to invest in their crypto literacy. And I think that has been happening, particularly in the US, for a long time. And again, not globally consistent, but something that we're seeing lots of progress in. In Elliptic, what we do is work very closely with both regulators and law enforcement agencies to support that work. And you said in your question, Tom, Elliptic's about tracing, which we absolutely are, but we're also about helping the exchanges, the regulated sector, be preventative and detect those transactions before they can actually happen. So, the other side of what we do is make sure that, the faster we can identify those ransomware wallets and identify them in our data set for the benefit of our customers, the better equipped they are to make sure that they're not processing payments that go to those. So, there are a significant proportion of regulated and very responsible crypto operators out there, whether they're exchanges or other parts of the infrastructure that are, complying with their anti-money laundering obligations. But it's about identifying the gaps and the spaces where that's not happening, and trying to fill in, those weaknesses in the kind of regulatory shield, if you like.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. So I think we've done a good sort of tour de table, as it were. I know one of the things we wanted to talk about, so let's get it out of the way right away, is the whole question of safe harbor. And so, Misha, if I could come to you first, and then if anyone else wants to come in, do just catch my eye. I mean, it seems as a simpleton in all this, it seems as though the kind of Russian government is allowing a permissive environment for ransomware groups in their borders, and indeed other countries. So, why is this? Can we unpack just why do they feel this is something that they should just allow to happen? Are they just allowing it to happen, or is that a wrong characterization?
And no, I wouldn't say so. It's a correct characterization. My researchers took me back to the year 2000, where there was evidence of a lot of carding activity coming out of Russia and Ukraine. Carding activity, of course, being the theft and sale of credit card and debit card data, which was quite a plague at the time. And I spoke to people who were involved with that business, Russians and Ukrainians, and they told me quite up front that they were approached by the FSB and told that they would be, that the FSB, that the Russian state would come down on them very heavily if they started attacking any systems within the then CIS, the Community of Independent States, mainly former Soviet states, but specifically Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine is what they mentioned. And they also said that if required, the skills of criminal hacking groups would be suborned to the requirements of the Russian state. And we saw that in 2007 in Estonia, where a lot of the massive DDoS attack on Estonia was routed through servers that had been identified as belonging to one of the biggest Russian criminal networks at the time. So there's quite a long history to this, but and I know, for example, that after the Litvinenko death, the emerging collaboration between British law enforcement and the MVD in Russia, the Russian Interior Ministry, was a collateral victim of the dispute around Litvinenko. Both the FBI and SOCA, the Serious Organized Crime Agency, had emerging cooperation and quite good cooperation with the Interior Ministry of Russia, which after the deterioration in relations in the mid-2000s basically came to a grinding halt. But on the other side, I'd like to point out something which isn't often mentioned, and that is Russia and China both have very serious domestic cybercrime problems themselves. What they don't do is they don't advertise them. So whereas when you have an attack in the United States or in Europe, it's very quickly quite a big news story. That doesn't happen the other way around. But I was invited to a conference in Moscow 2 years ago, which Sberbank, the largest bank in Russia, was organizing, and they are monopolizing the cyber security industry, or attempting to monopolize the cyber security industry, because they understand for political reasons that this is going to be very important. And what I've noticed both there and in China is that the private sector in both those countries are pressurizing the state to start cooperating with the West on this issue. Because they don't see it as a political or national security thing. They see it essentially as a criminal problem. And so I actually believe that there are potentially areas of cooperation between the great cyber powers, as it were, which just haven't emerged in public, and that's partly because of the secrecy in Russia and the transparency over here. But there's no question that up till today, Russia uses criminal groups and both to further their national security interests, but they also do not prosecute and allow criminal groups to operate out of there, because for them it's a useful irritation to the West. I wouldn't say they're trying to bring the West down or anything like that, but they can interfere in processes very easily at very little cost to themselves. And if the West does respond, as we know that the United Kingdom did after the Skripal poisonings, because that was admitted by a senior government official, we don't exactly know what happened. So we never know the details of what happens inside Russia or China, but we do know that they have serious problems themselves.
Ciaran, if I could come to you, I mean, is that a picture you recognize from your time? Do you see areas for potential cooperation? I was interested to hear Misha make that point. And also, while I've got you, what of responding? You know, what of hitting back? You have your perspective on that, and then maybe we'll turn a bit more to the payment side.
Well, I would rarely try to take on Misha Glenny with an analysis of the internal dynamics of the Russian state and how it deals with cybercrime, because there's no greater authority, certainly in the English-speaking world. But I do recognize that, firstly, I think the point that he amplifies about, you know, it's not as if Russia and, for that matter, although less relevant to today's discussion, China, have cybercrime problems of their own is absolutely accurate. I think that the point about the Russian state's sort of Faustian pact with these groups over a 20-year period is bang on as well. And again, so given all that and the fact that, you know, and I think the point about it's fine to irritate the West rather than threaten it is also, you know, it has suited the Russian regime for a number of years. So I agree with that analysis. Is there potential for cooperation? That all depends on the previous point we're debating. You know, do these become too much of an irritant for the Russian regime? And even then, there'll be limitations. You know, this is a country, by my understanding, that has a constitutional prohibition on the extradition of its citizens. So, you know, if you're talking about, for example, even though we're now outside the European Union, if you're talking about cooperation with most other European countries and in terms of the United Kingdom, if someone is inflicting large-scale harm in the UK, we would expect a cooperative arrangement with France, with Romania, with whoever, but we can't ever expect that with Russia. So there'll be limitations even on the most optimistic scenario. On hitting back, well, I don't want to call it that, and I certainly don't want, just as I wouldn't privatize the response on the defensive level, I wouldn't privatize the response at offensive level. I mean, hacking back is a crazy idea, and it's another seminar. But it's you know, I do not know what possible justification there'd be for it. Having said all that, in terms of state capabilities, I do think, and I've recently published a short piece on this for a new offensive cyber blog. Offensive capabilities have struggled at state level, have struggled to establish themselves as useful for cybersecurity as distinct from useful for overall security. So in the sort of 5 to 10 to arguably in the US side 15-year history of state offensive cyber capabilities, they've mostly been used against terrorists and pedophiles and you know offenders like that. They've actually really struggled to deter cyber attacks. The one area they might be of use is in this sort of area where, you know, with law enforcement, we had some great operations that were law enforcement led, like the Emotet bot takedown and so forth. Doing more of that for two reasons. One is it is much less escalatory than hacking another state infrastructure. And secondly, you know, because of the technical nature of the operations, it's easier to do without that sort of accidental risk that you infect thousands of completely innocent computer networks and cause some sort of WannaCry in reverse, if you know what I mean, where you launch a computer network attack and it goes horribly wrong and injures and acts to the detriment of lots of innocent people. So there may be a limited and useful role for government, responsible government offensive operations against ransomware operators, and it may degrade some of the biggest players. I suspect it will be more of a super tactical rather than strategic solution, however.
Great, thank you. So Jen, I wanted to come to you. You were one of the co-chairs of the ransomware task force, the report which was published earlier this year. And I was struck when we think about payments by a comment in that report, which suggested that the task force couldn't come to a consensus on the issue, recognize that paying ransoms is detrimental in a number of ways, but also recognize the challenge inherent in barring payments. Can you sort of unpack those challenges for us?
Absolutely. And I will say I couldn't come to consensus within myself even. This is a thorny issue. From an ideological point of view, I think most people agree that you want to ban payments. There's a number of reasons. Fundamentally, we are funding crime, and that's a bad thing. There is a school of thought that the kind of crime you're funding is not just more ransomware, but also things like human trafficking and child exploitation and that kind of thing. Misha can probably comment on that better than I can. So some really nasty things. So like, number one, you don't want to fund some bad crime, it's bad. Number two, the more that we fund, the more that we show that there's a payday, crime that is motivated by profit will expand. And as Misha mentioned, these attackers exist in a place where there's very little friction for them. Actually, the level of sophistication or skill required is relatively low. You can always go after ransomware as a service and get someone else to do the heavy lifting. The chances of prosecution are low. And so really, there's little friction. They're going to go after it, and they can make a really big payday. I mean, the reported amount being asked for the master key for the Kaseya hack is $70 million. It's insane. And so, you can make a lot of money. And so the theory is, if we ban, not only is it the right thing to do, but also it should actually stop the attackers over time. Like, the attackers will say, well, I'm not going to make money from doing this. I'll go and spend my time doing other things. I'll get a real job. No, probably not. But still, they'll go elsewhere. The problem is, while I think everybody pretty much agrees with that, unfortunately, as I said, no friction for them, no risk. So when you first ban, what they're going to do, or even if they think you're going to ban, what they're going to do is they're going to be like, okay, we like this game of chicken, we're good to play. And they're going to target organizations that are least able to resist paying. So you're looking at either critical infrastructure, which cannot face the burden of disruption because they are delivering an essential service, or small to medium businesses that simply don't have the ability to have resilience for this kind of thing. You are somebody who's running your own little business, you've dedicated your entire life to it, gets hit by a ransomware attack, you are genuinely facing an existential threat. Like, that's your business gone. So the likelihood is, if we ban payments, that attackers will focus on these groups. Now, governments can respond to that. Governments can say, okay, we're going to help, we're going to create a safety net, and we're going to say, if you get hit and you meet some criteria, then we will fund your response. The problem with that is response still takes time, and it's still a huge process. HSE, the Irish Health Service, got hit, as Ciaran mentioned earlier, and 4 days later they got the keys, the decryption keys. They've still said that recovery is going to cost $600 million and take months. And so you end up in a situation where, even if you say to organizations, hey, we'll be your safety net, there's still a really practical impact here of like, can you really have downtime for essential services for that amount of time? Can these businesses tolerate it? So what I think we kind of got to is, a lot of people had a point of view of, banning payments seems like a good thing to do in the long term. Like, it seems like a desirable outcome. we just don't know how to do that pragmatically speaking. We don't know how to make it work in a way that isn't going to create a lot of unintended harm in the short term. And so that's the dilemma, and that's what we have to figure out.
So it's a good objective to have, but how do we get there? Graeme, I think you want to come in.
Yeah, and Jen, that safety net obviously is where the insurance industry is filling the gap. That is exactly what it provides. And contrary to popular belief, I'm certainly not against banning ransoms. I just think practically it's incredibly difficult. And what I've always advocated is the concept of a licensed system with the Treasury. I personally worry that there are lots of private sector security companies that popped up out of nowhere with no regulation, no training, no supervision. They're now engaging in high-level negotiations with sophisticated actors, some state actors, some non-state actors, over ransom payments. Not all necessarily working with Simone's firm or some of their competitors to actually start that very point, because you can only track it if you know when it's being moved at the beginning. So what you need is a structured system of license. So there's a small number of heavily supervised, heavily regulated bodies, whether they be public sector or private sector, whatever it might be, that can actually decree when it's okay to make a payment. So what you do is you stop a situation like with Keatinge. If it was illegal to pay ransoms in the UK right now, and I know because unfortunately we are dealing with a very large number of businesses right now that, through frankly no fault of their own, are utterly crippled and are faced with very, very few options right now. And certainly there isn't a public sector white knight coming to save them. If we'd banned payments, they would be a significant disadvantage to all the other businesses which have just been attacked right now. So I think we have to create this mechanism where there can be some control, there can be license. We talk about kind of what's fueling it. Unfortunately, it has become easier to facilitate these payments. Money brokers have popped up whose sole purpose is to facilitate payments. Wind the clock back 18, 24 months ago, we wouldn't have been able to get our hands on 10, 20, 70 million of Bitcoin. That is a serious undertaking. Yet businesses are popping up to facilitate that. That needs more control. And that's where I see an opportunity for structure, and plugging in then to the blockchain analysis firms that can do that work to track it, which is complex and difficult, and plugging into exchanges so that it's harder for them to off-ramp. But we still have problems because there are good exchanges and bad exchanges, and there's plenty of bad exchanges in jurisdictions we can't touch. And that's the challenge.
But Simone, before I come to you, Ciaran, there's kind of a direct challenge to you in the Q&A, so you should put the record straight or explain, which is, do you still believe ransomware payments should be outlawed? Which I guess is referencing something you've been quoted on saying previously. Where do you see the solution in this?
Well, I'm not sure that I take a profoundly different view to Jen, in that I favour a workable ban. So I would favour coordinated study urgently across governments, because it's hard, but not impossible. I think it's less impossible than people think to do it at a single country level, about the sort of support and transition mechanisms that might make it possible. And there will be imperfections and there'll be perverse consequences and so forth. But the question will be on a risk calculus versus the harm that's being done now by the ease with which they're being paid. Which is better. So I remain in favour of a ban in principle. Let me just say, while I've got the floor, that contrary to some of the ways in which my own position has been represented in the past, I do completely agree with Graeme that you ban payments, not the people who may or may not facilitate payments. So banning insurers from covering payments but allowing payments doesn't make any sense. You ban payments, you don't. Rather than single out, you can't get it through a lawful insurance policy. It's not for insurers to make public policy. It's for governments to do it. So I'm completely with them on that. I also don't think it's a magic sort of panacea. It's part of a holistic response, which may include offensive options. It includes pressure on Russia. It includes strengthening of cyber defenses, better regulation of cryptocurrencies, and all of and all of that. But it's easy to concoct desperate situations, and there are desperate situations. Very occasionally it's risk to life, although those there aren't that many of those. More often it's a sort of horrible situation Graeme's grappling with today, and that's the sort of situation we really need to examine. But to be a bit provocative, I would invite people to read the statement by JBS Meat Company that paid Revel $11 million last week. Now, actually, JBS did us a service because they set out a public justification for paying. But read the statement. It says three things. One is, our systems are fine. They're not really damaged. They're working fine. Two, no data was exfiltrated, so we're not being extorted for data. But there's this vague notion of potential future harm to our customers, so we're paying as a precaution. $11 million. Okay, now just ponder that, because that's the opposite end from the sort of very difficult. A global giant is paying $11 million as a precaution. That sums up everything that's wrong with our incentive system. So, frankly, I'd ban that. I would find a way of banning that scenario as a presumption, because that is the privatization. What that is then fueling is not just serious organized crime, but it's fueling a systemic national security risk. And governments are hampering themselves from treating it and responding to it as a national security risk if the discretion of decision making is of that magnitude that now, a month later, the same group are closing schools in New Zealand and disrupting the Swedish villagers from buying food.
Point well made. I think Simone wants to come in, and then Jen, I'll come to you.
Cool.
Great, thanks, Tom. I just wanted to pick up really on something Graeme was saying, being able to access, significant sums of Bitcoin, not easy to do, but lots of folks, getting involved in doing that. And while a total ban that's workable will take some time to introduce, there are things that we can be doing in the meantime as well. And I think, this is a great example of where, we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of getting something done. And I think there's certainly on the crypto regulatory side that there are some actions that can be taken, whether it's looking to the regulated exchanges, particularly in the UK and the US, to say, proactively talk about the fact that you're not going to facilitate these payments, even though they're from your customers. That's something that would be interesting to see them take a stand on doing, as well as the other side of it, which is to see more regulatory enforcement. And following its June plenary meeting, the Financial Action Task Force noted that only 58 of 128 jurisdictions were implementing the FATF's global standards for cryptocurrencies. And so there's a lot of room there for the FATF, at the global level, and the US and the UK to be much more aggressively calling out those jurisdictions that are failing to adhere to those standards, because we know what's needed. It's really now about holding, those countries and those unregulated exchanges accountable. And global consistency is difficult and it takes time, but the more of those that we can shut down incrementally, the stronger position we put ourselves in.
Simone, I think you're very right there. When we talked about rules of the road internationally earlier on, I think we need to ensure that we're talking about rules across the whole piece, and certainly the crypto industry lags in a lot of places. Jen, I'll come to you, and then Misha.
So very quickly, just on a couple of things Ciaran said, and I just wanted to acknowledge that part of Paul's question that he asked in the Q&A was about what punishment should look like. And this is always a really critical part of deterrence. And nobody has addressed this in any meaningful way. Nobody has an answer to this question. And so and I'll agree, we in the task force did not get to that level of asking, but I do think it's a really important question, because again, it goes back to that piece around what are you looking at for the lower end of the market and organizations that really just don't have recourse? Are you going to put people in prison? But then at the other end of the market, are you just making this another write-offable business expense, right? And so there aren't good answers to that. And I just wanted to acknowledge that part of the question. The other thing I wanted to just add on the banning payments piece is, one of the other fears that we have is that if we ban payments, then payments will go underground. And that will actually make us all the more poorer for not having a good picture of what's really going on. And one of the challenges we have is, there is a lack of information. We need more information sharing. We need more transparency. We need to know more about what's happening. So payments go underground. One, we lose that information. But two, the people who then make them payments, they've now put themselves in the pocket of their attacker. They've made themselves even more vulnerable to their attacker. Their attacker is going to keep coming back to them and extorting them more and more and more. So just wanted to add those 2 quick points.
Yeah, I mean, that's an important point. It's become sort of almost like a mafia-esque relationship. I can come back and dip into your pocket whenever I want to. Misha, and then I'll come to Graeme, who started off this excellent.
I'll just make a very brief point about the Russia situation, and then I want to ask Simone a question. On Russia, it's difficult for us to apply any more sanctions on Russia in terms of trying to alter its behavior than we already do, because there are a huge number of sanctions on Russia as a consequence of Ukraine and Crimea in particular. So we are limited in terms of what we can do with Russia, particularly at a time when Germany wants to see the completion of Nord Stream 2. But I think Biden is going the right way about it, that he's not he's not responding hysterically, but making it quite clear, both publicly and privately, to Putin that this is unacceptable, behavior, and that the United States will formulate response in the foreseeable future. But it is very difficult to apply pressure to Russia at the moment, and the whole ransomware business is one area where, because Putin can claim it's deniable, even though we know it's not deniable, he can claim deniability. It's not something that he's likely to give up in the short term, I don't think. The question I have for Simone is Bitcoin, of course, the primary driver of the value of Bitcoin is not criminality. It is speculation. It's hedge funds, it's individuals, it's Elon Musk and his varying opinions, of course. Why is it, I'd ask Simone, how much of that activity is actually criminal activity? And how much of it has shifted to Monero and other more secure currencies? And why hasn't the value of those secure currencies gone up? Are we talking about really a small, difficult to identify percentage of cryptocurrency value that is affected by criminal activity?
So as the question was directed at Simone, I'll allow you to come in there. I noticed Ciaran tweeting a question yesterday about the demand that was made in Bitcoin as opposed to Monero, with obviously the issues related to that. But Simone, your thoughts on that, and then I'll come to Graeme, I promise.
Yeah, sure. So actually, based on our research, less than 1% of all crypto activity is related to criminal activity, although probably 75% of the news headlines are dedicated to Bitcoin in criminal activity stories. So it is a very small proportion. It's getting smaller every year. Ransomware as a proportion of that 1%, though, is becoming a bigger proportion, as you would expect. I think there are a couple of reasons why Monero is not being used more, although it is coming onto the radar increasingly so. A number of the ransomware operators are encouraging their victims to pay in Monero, but there are reasons why they won't solely go there. Firstly, it's harder for people to buy and pay in Monero. It's not encouraged or regulated in the same way. So lots of exchanges can't offer those privacy preserving coins. So it's a lot harder to get hold of. There's also just not the same degree of liquidity and fungibility in those lesser used assets, which again makes it difficult to obtain and then wash significant sums. And then again, just coming to that regulatory point, most regulators by now have really clamped down on privacy preserving coins overall, which generally just makes them less practical from a usage point of view. But we are seeing it happen, and I think definitely one of the things we've been talking to regulators about is making sure that they are covering off the privacy preserving coins clearly as they're developing their regulations.
Thanks, Simone, for that. So I just checked the clock. Our hour has flown past. But Graeme, seeing as you've been patiently waiting to respond to what's come before, I'll give you the last word, because you seem to have the toughest job here today. That's
incredibly kind, Tom. So last bit to defend insurances. We sometimes feel if we're damned if we do, and we're damned if we don't. I'll just pick on the two questions on here. That this kind of concept of insurers shouldn't pay or fund this. And there's a comment about AXA in France's response, and AXA France deciding not to. And of course, the immediate response from many people to that was that our product's no longer fit for purpose. It's the insurance industry not meeting customers' needs. Okay. And then on the other side, if we do facilitate it, then we're fueling crime. I think that the principle here is, as Ciaran said earlier, it's not the insurance industry's job to set public policy or to create laws. It's our job to follow the laws. And I believe me that there's a question here about sanctions. We are petrified of sanctions. We're petrified of anti-money laws. We are heavily regulated financial services businesses. We have to jump through fiery hoops before any money can move, believe me. And there are tools available. I keep looking at right now, so why Revel has not appeared on any sanctions list anywhere in the world right now, yet they're demanding $70 million. If governments wanted to ban the payment of ransoms, they'd do that right now, and we wouldn't be able to move that money. Nobody would. So
that's as a dedicated follower of sanctions, that's a powerful point to end on, and indeed we will have to end. The hour has flown past, as I said. Thank you all very much for joining us. I mean, it's clear to me, it's a hackneyed phrase, but we obviously need a whole of system response. I was struck by Ciaran's characterization of the deck being almost entirely stacked in the favor of the bad guys. And you didn't say this, but I get the sense from this conversation that to some extent we're our own worst enemies. So yes, we need to emphasize cyber hygiene, patch, as Jen said, but there clearly needs to be a much more sophisticated consideration of the issue. Diplomatic pressure. Let's see what comes out of whatever President Biden happened to say to Vladimir Putin at their recent meeting. That clearly needs to be applied to a greater extent. And I often look at this issue through the lens of what goes on in the offline world as relates to ransoms. I'm not sure how much we can learn from the offline world, but clearly I think we should definitely at least think of that. And this is not obviously a problem that is going to go away, and we obviously need to travel a long way if we're going to blunt the ease with which hackers seem, frankly, right now to be able to extort funds almost at will. So thank you all very much for joining. I have to just share just a brief information slide here at the end, because it's an area that clearly requires continued policy development work. That's a very strong point I think we take away from today, and something we're keen to look at and invest in at RUSI, and bringing together the work being done by our cyber research team and the financial dimension that we bring from our financial crime and security studies team. So if anyone joining us today is interested, do get in touch if you'd like to know more about our plans, or are interested in exploring ways about how you might be able to support us. And with that, and with great appreciation, I'd like to thank again our panelists, Jen Ellis of Rapid7, Simone Maini from Elliptic, Ciaran Martin, former CEO of the UK's NCSC, Graeme Newman from CFC Underwriting, and journalist and author Misha Glenny. Thanks to you all. As I say, I've been Tom Keatinge of RUSI's Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies. And until next time, stay well and have a good day. Bye for now all.